comedy, of course, is different from tragedy. And like tragedy, it has its own set of conventions. Now, Restoration comedy is much more widely known right now than the tragedies of the period. So, some of them you might actually even be familiar with or have seen produced on stage, but they continue to be really popular. The one that you read for this week, Wycherley's Dancing Master, has been produced, and it's not as popular as some of his other plays, but I think it's a really interesting one for our purposes. So the first thing you need to know about Restoration comedy is that the characters are not profound human beings with complex interiors. They more like fall into types. And so if you, as you read more than one Restoration play, you'll see, oh, there's a rake. There was a rake in the last play. Oh, look, there's a fop. There's a fop in the last play. So this kind of categorization of types, your job is to think about how each one is a little bit different from the last one because they're never exactly the same. And so, of course, all literature takes place within a set of conventions. And a lot of the conventions, you know, when you watch a television show or a movie, there are a set of conventions that are assumed. Mostly for things that are in your own cultural moment, they tend to be invisible to you because you've just grown up with them and you accept them. And then you come across these conventions in the 17th century and they're like, whoa, that's so weird. But in fact, once you understand the conventions, then you understand the plays a lot better and you can appreciate them a little bit more. So one of the conventions of Restoration comedy is that the characters, again, are not so much meant to be fully realized individuals with psychological depth as they are meant to be somewhat broad types. So the enjoyment and the value in Restoration comedy is less the depth of characterization than the wit, than the plot twists and the incredibly sharp observations about society. So the kind of comedy that emerges in the Restoration is generally called the comedy of manners. So the Restoration didn't invent comedy of manners, but it really developed it. And a comedy of manners is a play in which there's a kind of interest in how people respond to each other within or beyond what the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu calls your class fraction, your particular place in the social world. And so Restoration comedies tend to be observations of manners. So let me back up a little bit and explain what we mean by manners. So manners is not like, well, I mean, it's also which fork are you going to use for your salad. That's one way of thinking about manners. But the other way of thinking about manners is how is it that we manage to form a society by signaling each other in particular ways. So you send an email and you say, "Dear Professor Rosenthal," you know, that's a convention. You don't have to say that. You could just start it on your message, but it's conventional and it's kind of manner. And the way you suggest it is actually going to say something about you and the person who you're addressing. You might instead say, "Hey," or "Hello, Laura." Those were all different ways of addressing me, and they mean slightly different things. So those are all manner, even if they literally mean the same thing, they have slightly different connotations. So we do this constantly all day, and we're not even aware that we do it. So when those rules are brought to the surface, it's kind of funny because we don't think we have them. We think we're behaving naturally. We don't think we're behaving according to rules, but it often makes us laugh when somebody points those out. So this is happening in plays in the Restoration. In the Restoration, there was a particular fascination with the rules of rank or class or status in society. So why did this happen? Well, I think one of the reasons is that they had just been through this civil war and almost everything is up for grabs. And so there was a group challenging royal authority. The king was actually brought back, invited by Parliament. So this whole idea of the king as having absolute authority was really seriously undermined in the Restoration. And a lot of historians think that that's kind of the beginning of, now, monarchs are just kind of window dressing. I mean, very expensive window dressing, but they don't really have political authority. Certainly, Charles II had a lot of political authority. It's not all like that. But, there was a kind of, or you have to think there must have been a change if people believed that the king was God's choice on earth, and then the king was beheaded and nothing really happened. Wasn't an earthquake or a thunderbolt or, there wasn't an immediate divine reaction, which may have brought about some skepticism about why this guy is telling me what to do. So that kind of skepticism about hierarchy filtered to the entire society. And there's a wonderful book, really kind of an old book, but it's still wonderful, by Susan Staves. It's called Players' Scepters. And her argument is that in the Restoration period, the people in general demanded that their leaders think of the relationship between the monarch and the people as one of a contract, as you saw with Hobbes. So that means that it's not a given that both sides have obligations, and then the people can kind of say, well, if you don't fulfill your duties as a king, as they did to Charles I, maybe we'll kill you. And so that actually makes the king a little more on guard about the kinds of things that he thinks he can do, or she, if it's a queen that happened to be a king at this time. So Staves' argument is that if you look at Restoration comedies, they're kind of about that. They're kind of about rebellion against authority, but then they're also about women saying, well, there's an analogy here, because if the king doesn't have absolute power over the people, maybe the husband doesn't have absolute power over the wife, and maybe there's some room for negotiation there. So you do get a lot of instances, especially in the comedies, where, as you do in The Gentleman Dancing Master, of women rebelling against some kind of authority, and also couples rebelling against parental demands that they marry somebody who they don't want to marry. And it was actually, one reason people would come from the country to London would be to find a spouse for their kid. And that would be where the, marriage market would be taking place. So these plays that are set in London and taking place in London are often about young people rebelling against that system too. And so we're almost always on the side of the young couple in these plays. They're, the father is almost always, in comedy, often made a fool of in some way. That's kind of the fun part about comedy. The theater is also, the institution itself is associated with the royalists. So this somewhat kind of mitigates the sense of rebellion, because the Puritans didn't like theater at all. And so the people who are attracted to theater were often more royalists, and the king and the king's brother, James II, who would eventually become the king, were great patrons of the theater. So there are kind of arguments where people say, well, the theater is just a mouthpiece for the royalty. And I think there's definitely something to that. They had to please their patrons, and they were supported by the royalist side. But at the same time, there was a lot of, rebellion in the comedies themselves, and a lot of criticism. And I think comedy was one of the places where you could say things that were kind of radical and get away with them. So anyway, back to Comedy of Manners. So Comedy of Manners are also often about kind of who most deeply understands the social norms. And the people who, and everybody understands them if they function at all to some extent, but some people understand them a little more than others. And in the Comedy of Manners of the Restoration, often you have a character who understands them so well that they're able to manipulate them to their own advantage. And so they will trap people because they must follow certain norms of behavior that the people they're trapping aren't really quite aware that they're being led into this trap. So characters study and comprehend these norms, and they manipulate them. And so later we'll talk a little bit about sentimentalism. Often in these plays there's no sentimentalism. They're kind of Hobbesian figures who are manipulating other people for their own advantage. And that makes it funny. Because the characters are Hobbesian in the sense that, as you read for this week, they're in a restless pursuit for power. So they're not satisfied with where they are. They're always trying to get more status, more money, more sex, more coaches, bigger houses, whatever it is, they want it. And so that's what's happening in these, but they have to acquire them within these particular manners. So that's always the joke between the desire and the way the manners are enabling them or blocking them. The funny part is, as mentioned before, when the social norms get disrupted, and that's when you see them. You see them most clearly when they're transgressed. And so we still have Comedy of Manners. Television sitcoms tend more toward the sentimental, but some of them are Comedy of Manners. And one of my favorite ones is Seinfeld. This is an older one, but it's so much a Comedy of Manners because the characters are always in some kind of competition with each other, and the episodes often involve like a violation of social norms, and the characters kind of think about the appropriate response. And so comedy has a really great grasp, especially Comedy of Manners, of social status. So here's an example, a classic one from a Seinfeld episode.
Buddy, watch it good.
Okay.
Hey! Oh, is that a label maker?
Yes, it is. I got it as a gift. It's a Label Baby Junior.
Love the label baby. You know, those things make great gifts. I just got one of those for Tim Watley for Christmas.
Tim Watley?
Yeah, who sent you that one?
One Tim Watley.
No, my Tim Watley?
The same. He sent it as a thank you for my Super Bowl tickets.
I think this is the same one I gave him. He recycled this gift. He's a regifter.
Or maybe he liked your gift so much he decided to get me the same thing. Perhaps it's an homage.
Yeah, perhaps.
Well, how did he react when you gave it to him?
He said, "Oh, a label maker. How about that?"
He repeated the name of the gift?
Yeah, so?
Oh, well, if you repeat the name of the gift, you can't possibly like it.
What do you mean?
Oh, like when someone opens something up and they go, "Oh, tube socks." What are you gonna do about it?
I don't know. I guess I'll just get invited up to his apartment and see if he's got a label maker.
Why'd you get him a gift anyway?
Oh, he did some dental work for me. He didn't charge me, so I thought I'd get him a Christmas present.
Yeah, well, if you're getting him anything for his birthday, I'm a large.
In the episode that you just saw, the characters consider the social acceptability of regifting, of giving a gift that you've received, because of course that violates the idea of the gift. But if you think about it rationally, there's really nothing wrong with it. Here's a label maker. Maybe you don't want it. You want to give somebody else a gift and thank them. Maybe they might want it. So there's really nothing wrong with it if you think about it from a rational perspective, from a use value perspective. But somehow, because the gift is attached to some kind of personal meaning, some kind of prestige or social status, or knitting a social group together, it becomes a really vexing issue. And so when things become vexing issues, then they're funny. Then you laugh because all of a sudden social norms are revealed to you. And so again, and that's what's great about comedy, because there's social norms that in your daily life you just don't even see. You just operate by them unconsciously. Another more recent one that I think kind of qualifies as a comedy of manners is Schitt's Creek, which is really popular. And the reason it definitely has sentimental elements in it too. It's not a pure comedy of manners, but the whole premise is a comedy of manners premise, because high status people are forced to live with low status people, and the comedy emerges in the gap between those two statuses. And so you see how, in a society that's supposed to be a classless society, you see how clearly delimited the really minute exigencies of class are. I mean, that one, in that comedy, the premise is fairly broad in this clash between these two cultures, but others are more subtle. Another old classic one is The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, which is a comedy that launched Will Smith's career. And so that actually has the opposite joke, where a low status person lives with high status people. And so comedy ensues, and there's clashes between the microcultures. And of course that one is sentimental as well. And then a really old one that you might not even know about, which maybe is like the ancestor of all of them, is a comedy called Green Acres, which had Zsa Zsa Gabor in it. And she's a Manhattanite, and she marries this guy who wants him to go live in a farm. And it's actually like really similar in some ways to Schitt's Creek, because the joke is always that these elite Manhattanites have to deal with small town country people. So this is the premise of so many common Beverly Hillbillies. I don't, I know I need to update my comedy list, but it tends to be a premise of much comedy. And so the Restoration sort of launched this in the investigation of the exigencies of class and manners, and how when you reveal the differences between those and the manners that allow you to keep your class status, it's funny. Because it's distressing. And so comedy is not like a way of sweeping these issues under the rug. It's a way of revealing these issues in a way that will get you beheaded. So that's a comedy of manners, and I hope you enjoy The Gentleman Dancing Master.